Okay, can we get everyone sitting down, please? We're about to start the next session. And the next speakers are being zoomed in live from the UK, and they've given up their time on a Saturday afternoon. So we're incredibly grateful for them to do that. So I'd really like us to get started. So our next session involves a panel of speakers, and I am really excited to introduce this particular panel. Firstly, they're in England. The panel includes Dr. Wendy Jones from Great Ormond Street Hospital for Children, who, as many of you will know, led the research when WSS was genetically identified back in 2012. But the panel also includes Dr. Camilla Elphick, who is not only one of the 3 members of the WSS Psychology Lab, but is also my son Alex's godmother. And she is also the very talented artist who did the art for the Sad Frog book. Shameless plug here. If you haven't already bought a copy, there are copies out in the lobby area. And donations to the foundation, please. And Dr. Elphick is now going to introduce the rest of the panel.
Hi, Annabelle. Can you hear me, first of all?
Yes, loud and clear.
Fantastic. Hello, everybody. Yeah, thank you so much for letting us speak at this event. It's something, I have to say, personally, I've been really looking forward to. I have to say, yeah, conducting this research and preparing the talk has been quite a personal journey, because I've really done it inspired by my wonderful cousin, who I hope is here. So I've watched his growth and development with huge admiration, but I've also been really aware of how difficult things were for him and his family when it came to getting a diagnosis and understanding what Wiedemann-Steiner actually means. So I was driven to create the Wiedemann-Steiner syndrome psychology lab with Nicola and Jess, who both stepped up amazingly when I approached them with this sort of crazy idea to start a research group. So it really couldn't have happened without them. So I first of all want to introduce Jess. She did her undergraduate degree at Sussex University, and she was awarded a scholarship for conducting the research that you're going to hear about today, which is absolutely wonderful. So I'm thrilled we've got her here today as well. She's now doing a master's, or just finished a master's, at the University of York. And also, so Nicola is the other co-founder of Wiedemann-Steiner Psychology Lab. She's professor at the University of Sussex, which is in the south of England. And she is the director of Children and Technology Lab, which is known as Chat Lab, which has got presence on Twitter as well, if you're interested in following that. She's a coordinator of the Autism Community Research Network Sussex, and co-manager of Acorn Sussex, which is a autism community research network. So she has been invaluable in helping me get this far. So Nicola, if it's okay, I'm going to hand over to you to introduce yourself and Jane, if that's okay.
Yeah, thanks, Camilla. Well, you've introduced me very nicely. Thank you, Camilla. And I'm going to introduce Dr. Jane Waite, who's also here, who is Senior Lecturer at Aston Institute of Health and Neurodevelopment, which is in the West Midlands in the UK. And she's also co-director of the Cerebra Network for Neurodevelopmental Disorders. Camilla, would you like me to introduce the session now? Yeah, okay. So first, as Camilla has said, I just want to say thank you so much to the foundation and to everybody who's here for giving us this space to share our results. And you'll see that we've done a little summary, or at least Camilla has put this together, a lovely summary of our results, which is in your conference pack. And also Thor has very kindly and in a timely way done a QR code. So if you want those materials, they are on there. And, you know, they might be a handy thing to have in your bag next time somebody says, oh, Wiedemann-Steiner syndrome, I've never heard of that, or I must look it up on Google. And I should say as well that we have been listening in to some of the other presentations, and in particular the presentation that you've just had, the set of presentations. And I think I can say for all of us, we found that so engaging and inspiring, and what great advocates parents are for your children is just absolutely amazing. So the way we're going to run this session is we've pre-recorded our talks just in case there were any technical difficulties. They're really short and digestible, I hope. So what we're going to do is we're going to have the first two talks. They're just kind of 5 to 7 minutes each. The first one is me talking about the work that we did on behavioural patterns. We explain what the study involved in the talk. And then we're going to move straight on to Jess talking about her project on social vulnerability in WSS. Then we're going to have a space for questions and answers, which is obviously going to be live. So anything that you want to ask any of us about those talks, or any comments that you want to make, or any points you want to bring out that you think that we've missed, anything at all, we'll have a Q&A about that. And then we will watch Camilla presenting her talk on diagnostic experiences in Wiedemann-Steiner syndrome, and we'll have another question and answer session after that. Okay, so I think that means we can now move on. We've got a hashtag on Twitter in case anybody wants to put any questions up there. So you can ask us anything, and we're going to move on now to the first talk. Hello, I'm Nicola Ewell from the Children and Technology Lab in Psychology at the University of Sussex in the UK. I'll be reporting on what we found from talking to parents about the common behaviours and experiences in managing with a child who has WSS. We're very grateful to the many people and organisations for helping us with this, but parents have been our main source of help and inspiration. One of the big difficulties parents mention is professionals' lack of knowledge about how to provide best support for children with WSS. So school staff, general practitioners, other health and social care workers, and the public in general, who often don't understand the common behaviour challenges and the facilities needed to help WSS children to thrive. There's very little research on this, as most work covers more medical and genetic aspects. So in the summer of 2019, Jess Marshall had funding from the University of Sussex for a summer project supervised by me, but the topic initially inspired from Camilla Elphick. With the help of WSS in the UK and US, Jess and our researcher Hannah did phone interviews of about an hour long each with 25 parents of WSS children, 24 mums and a dad. The children, 11 boys and 14 girls, were aged from 2 to 32 years at the time of interview. Only 4 of them had no siblings, and 8 children also had another reported diagnosis of autism or ADHD. We typed out all the interviews carefully, taking care that any identities stayed hidden, so that we could search systematically for common themes using a technique called thematic analysis. Different people in the research team looked at the data independently and came up with similar ideas. The patterns we found fall under 3 main headings: intense sociability, intense and exclusive relationships, and volatility. We also found some common patterns in children's thinking and sensory patterns, so academic strengths and weaknesses and memory. And finally, we asked what strategies parents had used in managing and support for their children. So I'll go through each of these themes in turn. So first, the big theme of intense sociability. This fell into 3 parts, and you'll see on each slide I've put some quotes from parents that give you a flavour of the sorts of things that they said. So the unbounded sociability of many WSS children, 3/4 of parents mentioned this, and it's often the first thing that they told us. I won't read all the quotes out, but you might recognise them in children you know. Then the experience that WSS children's affection can be intense and often very physical. About half of parents mentioned this. Finally, in this theme, about 1/3 of parents also mentioned positivity or contentment in their children. We noticed that this was almost all with the younger children. All of these quotes were from children under 6, except for one 11-year-old. The second big theme was intense or exclusive relationships with different people. And again, this fell into 3 parts. First, Almost half of parents mentioned a strong preference for adults, some with a need for quite exclusive contact, often with the main caregiver, as one said, like Velcro. And for some children, this did relate to anxiety. Then parents cited the younger play patterns that their children showed, which of course depend on the age and developmental stage of the child. So when children interacted with peers rather than adults, they might be playing alongside rather than with other children, and sometimes their peers have outgrown the child's interests, which can be more typical of younger children. Having said that, the WSS children who had siblings often had intense and exclusive relationships with them, sometimes with a sort of love-hate pattern, which of course can happen in any sibling relationship, but having a sibling with a learning disability does affect sibling relationships. It's worth mentioning too that at least 2 children with WSS were reported to have very close friendships with a peer, both in middle childhood and in young adulthood. The third big theme was to do with being volatile or changeable. Again, there's 3 subparts to this. So the first part of this involves difficulty with transitions. So 80% of parents mentioned a lack of flexibility or a need for routine, together with difficulty in diverting the child. There was a big overlap of this aspect with the next sub-theme of impulsiveness, with well over half of the parents mentioning this. Parents especially spoke of flipping from positive to negative in a very short time and often quite unpredictably. This leads to the third sub-theme here, as one parent put it, a massive issue with aggression. 72% of parents mentioned this all across the age range. Now, for 2 of the 25 children, this was exclusively self-harm, but for other children, it also included 2 other people. And we understand that this is a big issue for families. This is what families told us. So here are the 3 big themes, but we also had some comments that we hadn't particularly expected or asked about, and those were sensory and cognitive patterns. Over 60% of parents noted that their child had sensory sensitivities, so this might be a mix of sensory seeking and sensory overload, and it included sound, taste, smell, and touch. Children varied in their communication and learning levels, but for academic patterns, some parents cited their child's very good word reading or vocabulary, but a relative weakness in understanding what they had read. Also mentioned children's remarkable memories, such as remembering a small detail from long in the past. We made a quick listing of strategies that parents had reported using, and in this slide, we've linked it to some handbooks on the Helpful Cerebra website, so these will be available to you after the talk. And we finish with some of the very positive experiences parents told us about. So you can see on these quotes here that there were some things that parents really valued and found special in their children. So thank you very much for listening. Here's our contact details, and we'll be happy to take questions.
Yeah, so if you could possibly play the next video, if that's all right, Thor, which is the one looking at social vulnerability, that would be great.
I'm Nicola Ewell from the Children and Technology Lab in Psychology at the University of Sussex.
Yeah, not this one.
I'll be recording.
Hello everyone, and welcome to my talk examining social vulnerability in children with WSS. So let's have a bit of background to start with. So for my undergraduate project at the University of Sussex, I conducted a survey looking at sociability characteristics in children with WSS, and I compared these to autistic children and children without a disability. I wanted to compare these 3 groups to see what social vulnerability looked like in WSS. So just before we start, what is social vulnerability? So for this study, we refer to social vulnerability as an impaired ability to detect and avoid harmful situations and interactions. Social vulnerability is a term that takes lots of forms, and this can include things like social isolation, bullying and abuse. The reasons I wanted to research social vulnerability in WSS are: very little is known about WSS psychologically or educationally, and most research is in genetic and medical aspects of WSS. Now, some of you may remember that in my last project I started investigating these behavioural characteristics of WSS, and I did this by interviewing parents of children with WSS, and I found that parents often said their children are socially confident and will often approach and talk to anyone, even if they don't know them very well. So I later went on to research this a bit more in the literature, and I found that children with other genetic disorders, which are potentially similar to WSS, also show these very social behaviours. So, for example, children with the disorder Williams syndrome, they show things like a lack of stranger awareness, and they sometimes aren't aware of social cues and often act socially inappropriately. So, because of these similarities, I wanted to investigate social vulnerability further, especially as parents raise some concerns about these behaviours, particularly as their child gets older. So I aim to find out whether children with WSS are socially vulnerable in different ways to children with other conditions, and whether being socially confident is a key feature of sociability in WSS. So I created an online survey, and this survey asked parents some background questions and then touched on their child's social vulnerability. And I compared these responses to parents of autistic children and parents of children without a disability. I had 128 parents who took part in the study, so thank you so much. And children were ages 4 to 17, 38% of them were female and 62% of them were male. The questions were broadly split into 5 categories, or subscales as they're known in the literature, and these were emotional abuse, risk awareness, social protection, vulnerable appearance and credulity. I found that children with WSS and also autistic children were rated significantly more socially vulnerable overall compared to children without a disability, and that's quite an unsurprising finding. And from this, we know that children with WSS are socially vulnerable compared to their peers who don't have a disability. I also found that children with WSS were rated higher on the vulnerable appearance subscale, and this subscale asks parents questions about how their child is perceived to others and whether others recognise that they have a disability, and also whether they are perceived as immature for their age. The other important finding was that children with WSS were rated as being less risk aware than autistic children and children without disabilities. And now this subscale asked about things like reading social cues, recognising dangerous situations, and telling parents if something questionable happens. So the important things that we need to take from these results are that children with WSS are socially vulnerable according to this questionnaire, and they are particularly vulnerable in areas related to risk awareness and how other people perceive them. So what do these results mean, and what can we take from them? Children with WSS often display a social profile of something known as hypersociability, and this means that they are highly social, as the name suggests, and that they also display social behaviours like talking to strangers or approaching people that they don't know. This social profile of hypersociability is similar to the profiles that are seen in other genetic disorders like Williams syndrome. So for future research, it would be really useful to look at the similarities and differences in these profiles in a bit more depth, and to see whether there are already some pre-existing interventions that have helped others with a hypersocial profile, so other children with other disabilities, and whether these could be used for children with WSS. And this may help with some of the social differences that may be more challenging, like approaching strangers and not understanding dangerous situations. And as I've said, these findings are just the start of the research into social vulnerability in WSS, But what they do is they begin to give us an insight into the ways in which children with WSS are socially different from their peers. And now we know this, we're beginning to share these results with stakeholders, so including health and education practitioners and teachers and parents, like we're doing today at the WSS conference. We're very keen to raise awareness of these findings so that more people have an understanding of just some of the characteristics of WSS. I'd like to thank the WSS Psychology Lab for helping me with the project and for helping me create this talk. And I'd also like to thank you all for listening and for taking part in my survey. Thank you very much.
So I think, if it's okay, we can move to questions now.
Hello everyone and welcome to my talk.
We don't want that talk again. Has anyone got any questions at this stage for Nicola or Jess, really? I've got a couple online, so I'll start with these then. Question for Nicola then. What do you think schools need to do to cater better for children with WSS?
So obviously knowledge is one really important thing about this, isn't it? I mean, WSS is something, so this whole issue was introduced to me by Camilla, and it has been fascinating. Most of the work that I do the rest of the time is in relation to autism, and in particular autistic children with learning disabilities. And there are two things that we are doing there which I think could also perhaps be useful in Wiedemann-Steiner syndrome as well. And one is, I think this has been mentioned at the conference already, is neurodiversity training in schools. And I know I'm involved in a couple of local projects with Acorns to do with creating lessons for teachers to, so for primary school children, you know, children aged kind of 7, 8, 9, to explain to those children about neurodiversity, what it means, how everybody's different, how different people have different needs. So that's just in development at the moment. And I know there's initiatives in other places as well. So that neurodiversity training really needs to include all kinds of neurodiversity. Obviously, it's been pushed in the autism community because that has become such a more common diagnosis, but it really needs to look at neurodiversity of all types. The other project I've been involved with, which is a current one, so there's not a lot out there to look at in relation to it yet, is we've been creating with families and children, autistic children with learning disabilities, little short video stories that we use for schools, for health settings. So when in the UK, children have something called an education, health and care plan. And in that care plan, there's a space for the child to give their views. And sadly, sometimes that space is completely blank because if the child doesn't talk, it's like, oh, well, they can't tell us anything. And we've been particularly keen to ensure that children's voices and parents' voices are showcased in videos that they make themselves with some support, and those videos are just as useful. I mean, they show a more positive picture for a start, and don't just look at, oh, there's all these problems you're going to have when this child comes into your class. We don't want that to be the first impression that a teacher has. So they're done from a very kind of positive point of view, but they still tell the school about the needs that the child has. So when we say, for example, that a child with Wiedemann-Steiner syndrome is very sociable, that tells you something really lovely. But it also tells you that there might be some risks there that need to be mitigated. And it's not about, it's not about changing that in the child necessarily. It's saying, here, this is the environment that we have to provide for this child, for them to be safe and to thrive. I'm not going to say anything about other strategies. We did have strategies, we did have that strategy slide, and I know I pointed to Cerebra's websites, and that's something that Jane knows much more about than I do.
Can I just jump in and add some points there? So I think just to say that I agree completely with Nicola in terms of the idea that we need to raise awareness across the board of neurodiversity within schools. And Cerebra have also been working with educators recently to think about whether we can develop resources about children with rare genetic syndromes and some of the difficulties that cut across those groups. So again, it's that kind of cutting across, how can we reach more educators to kind of raise awareness generally around the needs of these children in a positive light, to be able to highlight some of the things that we see time and time again in some of these groups, such as social vulnerability. And then in terms of strategies, I think there's conversation that needs to be had really about where those strategies sit. And in terms of, I know clinical psychology services do quite a lot around kind of preparing people for adulthood in terms of how we support people through the use of role play activities, kind of practicing social situations that people might encounter, how to respond in those situations, and kind of thinking through what might be going on in those social situations. And those types of strategies can be really effective, potentially might be effective in the Wiedemann-Steiner group as well. I think once we have a greater understanding of the factors that kind of are underpinning that heightened social approach and social motivation.
I've got another question here. I think this one's for Jess.
Yeah, this is for Jess. I think when you did your research, you stumbled across what I consider some of the Wiedemann-Steiner kids' superpowers, which is that hyper sociability. As a personal observation, not a clinical one, how did you feel with some of them, maybe more readily accepted and maybe even loved? Did you have any anecdotal memories on that?
Can you just say that again? Sorry, I think it's a bit laggy for me. If you could just say it again.
I think you stumbled across in your research one of the superpowers of Wiedemann-Steiner kids, that is their hypersociability, their acceptance of people. Do you have any personal recollections or observations, not clinical, as far as some of those that you researched? Maybe they were very open and accepting to you personally. Maybe some anecdotal stories about that?
As in what the parents have said to me in the interviews?
Yes.
That's what the question's referring to. Okay, that's a lovely worded question, by the way, and I agree. I think the social aspect of WSS is fantastic, and it's great that kids are so open and keen to socialise. In terms of what parents said, there was a lot of agreement on they're just so loving and so willing to socialise and chat. One parent said, for example, that their kid would sort of just say morning to everyone walking past. It's that social openness that really interested me and made me think sort of why is this the case, and we should research this a bit more and see where they fall on that kind of hypo to hyper sociability spectrum, if you like, and how that looks for WSS. I hope that answered the question.
Have you got time for one more question, or do you need to play the next video?
I think we've got time.
Okay.
This question has to do with sensory sensitivity. And we have lots of kids who have sensory disorders and variable pain tolerances. Are those related?
I feel like I want, so I mentioned the sensory sensitivities, but that's not something I know an awful lot about. And I'm kind of hoping, I'm just looking at my other panel members and hoping that I can pick on somebody to answer that. And it looks like Wendy might be up for saying something about that.
Yeah, no, thanks, Nicola. I think that's a really good question. That's something I've never even considered, actually. But I think sort of sensory sensitivity is definitely something that I've sort of seen, or lots of parents have mentioned, and children kind of aren't sensitive to pain in perhaps the usual way, and parents will describe painful situations, them not reacting as much as normal. I'm not aware that these two things are linked, but that was a very good thought. Thank you for that question.
Should we play your next session and then we can have more questions after that?
That sounds great. Actually, just one thing before you press play.
In
if
this
it's okay.
presentation,
I was just going to say, what I wanted to say quickly here was that the data for this video are taken from the same phone interviews that were used for Nicola's talk, and the parents were asked open-ended questions. So what this means, they were introduced to a topic and invited to describe experiences in their own words. So they weren't constrained to talk about something they didn't want to, and they could talk freely about whatever was important to them. And actually going back to Nicola's talk, that was quite interesting about the fact that she picked up on parents mentioning their child's excellent memory, because that wasn't something we'd asked about. It was just something that parents were telling us, which I thought was interesting. But anyway, for this talk, what we started was we just asked parents this simple question, which is, please describe your experience of getting a Wiedemann-Steiner syndrome diagnosis before, during, and after receiving it. And then some parents were asked follow-up questions. But the main point is that they were able to talk freely about what was important to them. So that's fine. You can play the video now if you want.
I will be talking about research we did to understand what parents experience when going through a Wiedemann-Steiner diagnosis for their child. We based our analysis on previous research that explored parents' experiences of their child receiving a diagnosis of autism, as we felt that this would be a good starting point for understanding parents' experiences of their child receiving a diagnosis of Wiedemann-Steiner syndrome. The interview data was split into 3 parts: parents' experiences before diagnosis, during diagnosis, and after diagnosis. So starting with parents' experiences before a Wiedemann-Steiner diagnosis, we found 4 main themes: recognising differences, respecting parents, seeking answers, and delays. Recognising differences captured parents noticing behavioural and physical differences in their child, often from the moment they were born or as an infant. Over half mentioned behavioural differences, including things like feeding or sleep issues, unusual crying or breathing, and many of them noticed this from birth. When it came to physical differences, almost 2/3 mentioned noticing something, including being small, distinct facial features, or weak muscles, and most of them noticed this from birth. Respecting parents captured parents' descriptions of not being taken seriously or believed by clinicians, and inappropriate comments. Just under half mentioned that they were not taken seriously, and about 1/3 went as far as suggesting that they felt blamed for their child's issues or gaslit for expressing their concerns. 3 parents even mentioned insensitive comments that they remembered years later. It is also worth noting that some parents also spoke positively about their interactions with clinicians. Seeking answers captured parents' descriptions of urgently seeking a diagnosis. Just under half described actively doing this. One mentioned that a clinician asked her why she wanted a diagnosis, but in our interviews, parents were very clear. Over 1/3 wanted one because of medical uncertainty, 1 in 5 because they feared the future, and 2 for support. Delays captured parents' descriptions of the long wait for a diagnosis. Just under 1/3 described arduous and isolated journeys and or emotional difficulty. 1 in 5 described lack of certainty, while 3 described how their resilience dwindled. When it came to parents' experiences during the diagnosis process, we found 5 themes: delays, communication, assessment, relief and vindication, and shock and grief. Delays captured parents' descriptions of an indefinite wait for results. Over half described delays at this stage, and almost all of these were linked to genome research projects. Some also talked about the impacts of delays on stress and things like family planning. Communication captured parents' descriptions of the ways that they were told about the diagnosis. Almost 2/3 described issues with this. About 1/3 described vague, dismissive, or confusing communication. 4 that had been participants said that the news was delivered to them unexpectedly in a letter that used technical language about genetic aspects, but no further information or support, so they were left to make an appointment with their clinician for an explanation, and this usually meant more delay or anxiety. 3 described expecting a routine appointment, so they were unprepared for the diagnosis, and this was particularly difficult if they had gone to the appointment alone. Assessment captured parents' descriptions of the diagnosis appointment, where they either received the diagnosis itself or information about the diagnosis that they had received in some other form. About a third expressed being shocked or confused or left with unanswered questions, while just under a third described only being given basic information. I am glad to say, however, that a few parents described their assessment as a great experience. Relief and vindication captured parents' descriptions of positive emotions during the appointment. Almost 2/3 expressed relief, some of whom even felt vindicated that their concerns, which had not been believed or taken seriously before, were justified. Shock and grief captured parents' descriptions of negative emotions during the assessment. Some described the diagnosis as the beginning of grief or emotionally overwhelming, and one called it bittersweet, capturing the idea that emotional responses were sometimes complex. When we examined parents' experiences after the diagnosis, we found 5 themes: sharing information, understanding, support, family, and community. Sharing information captured parents' descriptions of how little clinicians knew, as they had seldom heard of Wiedemann-Steiner syndrome. Over a third said they got their information from other Wiedemann-Steiner parents, while about a quarter said that they knew more than the clinicians did. Understanding captured parents' descriptions of how they incorporated Wiedemann-Steiner into their child's identity, which was described by over a third of parents. For some parents, this process took a long time. Support captured parents' descriptions of their different support experiences. Just under half described actively seeking support and or valued support that they had received, while over a third described lack of support, often from schools, and or support that they desired, so things like respite care or funding. Family captured parents' descriptions of family members' reactions to the diagnosis. Just under a third described valued support, just under a third that their family didn't get it or accept it, and just under a third said that their family members were shocked or saddened by their diagnosis, while a few said that their family did get it after the diagnosis. Community captured parents' descriptions of the valued Wiedemann-Steiner community groups. Parents repeatedly brought up this wonderful Wiedemann-Steiner Syndrome Foundation, treasured Facebook groups, dedicated parent advocates, and the ongoing support of Dr. Wendy Jones, with enormous gratitude and warmth, which was a wonderful thing to hear. After receiving a Wiedemann-Steiner diagnosis, parents described how information flows between Wiedemann-Steiner families and onto clinicians and teachers, indicating that parents themselves are generating the growing knowledge about Wiedemann-Steiner syndrome. Most notably, one parent had created a list of follow-up tests for parents of newly diagnosed Wiedemann-Steiner children, which was valued by several of the parents we interviewed. The most heartwarming thing about parents' descriptions was how important the Wiedemann-Steiner community was. From this research, we have compiled a list of 10 considerations for clinicians when communicating with parents before, during, and after a Wiedemann-Steiner syndrome diagnosis, and you should have these in your conference pack. However, all but one parent had unanswered questions about Wiedemann-Steiner syndrome, so we counted them and found that there were 113 questions in total. These are questions for which clinicians and researchers should try to seek answers and find ways to communicate them to parents in simple and practical terms. I want to say a huge thank you to our parent participants who made this research possible. We believe that your voices as parents of children with Wiedemann-Steiner syndrome can be powerful forces for understanding the psychological impact of a Wiedemann-Steiner diagnosis and help to forge better diagnosis processes for parents of the future. So I just wanted to end with one story that I heard last week. A parent that I know who has a child with Wiedemann-Steiner let me know that she had been contacted with a newly diagnosed family. And this family had found her within 30 minutes of their diagnosis. So it shows that things are changing and improving for families. Thank you so much.
I think we've got time for some questions. Wandering around the room. Anyone got any questions that they want to ask any of the panel who've joined us?
I have a question. So you mentioned the 113, I think it was, unanswered questions that the families had. I'm kind of curious if you could maybe expand a little bit more on that, partially because we're in the process of updating our website. So I'm kind of curious if maybe we can figure out how to respond or how to reply to some of those as part of our website update.
Absolutely. So yeah, quite a lot of the questions. So I've actually got a slide up in front of me now to remind myself. We had 36 questions about the future. So people were asking things about life expectancy, life quality, education, strategies, finances, independence, and the potential. We had 25 questions about medical concerns. So these were things including pain. Well, I've seen some of the talks earlier today and yesterday. So pain, digestive issues, feeding, sleep, muscular issues, and immunity. We had 20 questions about information support. So support services, funding, respite care, education and learning, and stigma. And 17 questions were about lack of clarity. So people were still struggling a little bit to understand what the diagnosis meant and heritability. And I might bring Wendy in to talk about that in a minute, if that's okay, Wendy. And then we had 12 questions which were about emotion and behaviour. So things like fixing or managing behaviours and mental health concerns. So I had a quick word with Wendy about this about a month ago, and we were sort of thinking about how to look at some of these questions, particularly around the medical concerns and the lack of clarity in people understanding the diagnosis itself. I don't know, Wendy, do you want to say anything about that? Or sorry, I don't want to land it on you, but
no, not at all. And I think what we discussed really was that it's, you know, I guess when people, sorry, I'm not sure how clearly you can hear me, but I think when people, you can, good. So when people receive a diagnosis, it is, you know, it's something that I think we can think about a lot more in terms of how that information is given. I think this study highlighted that, you know, some people are given a result in a letter, some people are given a result in an appointment, some people are given a result in a routine appointment. And I think actually tailoring this to the specific family would be something that doctors could do better. So ask families, how would you like the results from this test? Would you like them in a letter first, or would you like us just to say we found something and let you know and see you in the appointment? I think another challenge is that you have often in 45 minutes, sometimes less, with the doctor. And during that time, you get the diagnosis, you get inheritance information, you have lots of probably unanswered questions because you weren't perhaps sometimes expecting it. And there's a lot to take in. I think that's one thing that we really recognise is you have this opportunity, you get the information. Many times families will be in shock, or they'll be upset, or they'll be surprised. And you know, I definitely think that some information, you know, is perhaps also not even taken in. So much of it's given, but sometimes things aren't remembered. And so I think this research is really important to help highlight how clinicians can support families. And I think some of the information is difficult. Some of those questions are really tricky because, you know, it is a very variable disorder. Obviously, the medical questions, you can always go back to your doctors to ask any medical concerns you have following the diagnosis. And I think some questions are hard to answer because it is a variable disorder and not everything is known about it. But I think this has been, you know, very important research in highlighting, both unanswered questions, but also highlighting how doctors do give diagnoses to families. And I think the lady earlier in the talk just before our session mentioning how she was sent, you know, she's a scientist, so she was sent, 3 articles. And I think that sounds, you know, extremely overwhelming, you know, as a parent, even as a scientist parent. So I think, you know, I think doctors don't always get it 100% right, but I think this is really helpful research in highlighting how doctors could get things better.
Thanks, Wendy. And I just wanted to add one thing as well, so that the videos are available on YouTube. So if you want to watch it back, you can see that slide in more detail. And also we will be sharing the printouts of the slides, the digital images on Twitter as well. But if you want any of the slides, just let me know and I can send them to you.
So you've obviously, between you, done quite a lot of research now into WSS using the original interviews. Are you planning to do any more work specifically involving WSS, whether it's behaviours or investigating what other resources might be available?
Do you want to take that one, Nicola? I mean, I know one area that actually I'd quite like to bring Alison in, if that's all right for you, Alison, is that with the interviews, we'd had 25 parents, but we had mainly women. There was 23 mothers and just 2 fathers. And I kind of feel that probably the experiences of mothers and fathers are probably rather different. So I don't know if you could say anything about that, Alison. Sorry, I didn't want to land you on that one, but
no, hi, hello everyone. Yeah, well, I think to say, rather than kind of point out whether the fathers' experiences are different from others, it's more to say that the experiences of fathers are relatively unexplored, that within kind of existing literature on fathers and their experiences of having disabled children, their experiences often come as secondary to that of mothers. So they're often kind of positioned or situated as the supportive or even the secondary parent. And also the majority of papers that I've recently done a review on fathers' relationships with their disabled children. So this is what I'm basing this information on. The review that I conducted with some colleagues found that the majority of papers focus on challenge, adversity and coping strategies, and there are very few studies that prioritise the more positive aspects of fathers' relationships with their disabled children. And actually, fathers have really complex and rewarding relationships with their disabled children, which is often kind of overlooked. So that's something that I certainly think that there is scope for. And I think it's really important to research the experiences of fathers to ensure that the kind of services and support that is offered to disabled children and their families are based on kind of accurate information about their lives and experiences. So does that answer that?
Well, thanks for stepping in there, Alison, as well. And I just saw Nicola's put a chat for me, so I think she wants to add something too. So thanks both for helping to answer that question.
Yeah, I just want to say, so in some ways this is an unusual project because it was all done from Jess's small summer bursary. So, you know, that's one reason it's taken us a little while to get it all together. But obviously we've also had the help from WSS foundations in the US and the UK, because that really helped us get the sample. But we have also kind of joined up with Jane and with Wendy, and I think that makes us much stronger to, you know, we've got their perspectives on the research, which is obviously hugely important. In terms of what I would be interested in doing next, I think because of the work that I've been doing on neurodiversity training in schools and on having parents co-creating accounts of their children, you know, that they create with their children, and so that they have the voice there, you know, in the clinic or the school or wherever else. So I'm particularly interested in that, because in the work that we've done with families with autistic children, that has been absolutely wonderful. I mean, one of the things we've done is to work with our medical school. So the medical students, as part of their training, go and visit families with an autistic child with a learning disability, so that, you know, when they're in a hospital or a general practitioner and somebody walks in the door, they have got at least a little bit of understanding, and, you know, so and when they're kind of suggesting treatments and things, they'll have that in mind. So that is a wonderful, you know, there are those wonderful early moves in making sure that people have a really good understanding of the lived experience of families. That's in relation to autism, obviously, but you know, needs to be extended. And I just want to say we have had a question on Twitter that I think relates to that. So Sarah Spears sent a wonderful question where she said, how might parents and schools leverage the social motivation of children with WSS, which I think is just such a fantastic question. And I think I'm not going to answer it directly, but I do think that those examples of creating really positive videos, you know, videos are quite a powerful medium to to help people understand the world through somebody else's perspective. I mean, for example, we've used webcams a lot, so you're literally seeing the world from the child's point of view. How does it appear to that child? So I do think that neurodiversity training and that better understanding is really key to saying we're not just fixing problems. Obviously, there are massive challenges that children with WSS face, and I think the parent part of the programme really expressed that very well. But we need schools to see that as well.
Is there anything that the foundation can do that would help parents from your research, either in respect of the diagnosis journey or to help prepare them for navigating doctor's appointments, school appointments, just to help their children in the future?
I've got one thing I could put in here, if that's okay. One thing I'd like to see, so a lot of the parents I think I mentioned in my talk said that there was a parent who'd provided a resource where people who were newly diagnosed could find out what kind of tests their child could have. And a lot of the parents really valued this. And I think that my perspective anyway, it'd be interesting to hear anyone's perspective if someone's got a different idea. I would like to see a central information hub where people could go to the moment they've been diagnosed. So it could be populated with information from professionals like teachers or doctors. And it could also have bottom-up information from parents, things like tips or strategies they'd found useful, because of course the parents are the experts. Obviously it would need to be vetted and managed, but it could also offer resources such as Jane's Cerebo website. And I feel that this would be a really good starting point for parents beginning on their journey if they just had all the information in one place. And I know this would be a difficult thing to launch, and it would be a difficult thing to manage. But I think that the Wiedemann Steiner Foundation would be a wonderful place to have a resource like this. I don't know if anyone has got any other feelings about that.
I agree. I think it's a very important thing, is going back to the interviews. It all goes back to the interviews, doesn't it? But going back to the interviews, and a lot of parents said the Facebook group was pretty much the only resource that I had. And I think for people to be able to signpost to parents to a website with lots of resources would be very, very beneficial, and hopefully quite reassuring and a good guide in some way when they first get the diagnosis. And if it could be updated, looking into the long term to help other parents in the future.
The website is being updated and created, and we'll certainly take all that on board. I'm going to put Wendy Jones on the spot a little bit here, because I know that through the Unique, or the Rare Chromosome charity in the UK, WSS currently isn't covered under their guides. And I think, Dr. Jones, you are in the process of writing that guide?
Exactly. We're doing the final edits, and actually I was going to ask the psychology team to add some bits as well, actually, but we're almost there. And I think when you do, so talking about what investigations people need, and so I think what is needed, many of the research articles state investigations that are needed, but actually there's quite a lot of science behind recommending investigations, because you want to make sure all children have had all of the relevant investigations they need. But what you don't want to do is subject children to investigations that they don't need, because for every investigation you might find an unusual finding and have to act on that, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the child has actually had a problem. So you do have to be very careful when thinking about investigations children need, and there are quite strong kind of guidelines about writing guidelines. And so what I've done is set up sort of an international group of collaborators. So it's all individuals who've carried out significant research into Wiedemann Steiner syndrome. So Hans Bjornsson, who many of you will know from the US, Fabiola from LA, who's written a large paper with Sarah Shepherd on Wiedemann Steiner syndrome, Sarah Baer from France, who's written a very large paper on Wiedemann Steiner syndrome as well. And so we've put together this group of collaborators, and we're working to put together some international consensus guidelines about what tests families need. So I think that the foundation have already very generously offered us some sort of financial support in putting the guidelines together. The group has met already virtually, and we're planning to meet again before the end of the year to start taking things forward. I think there's certainly people at NIH as well who are going to be having their own time to work hard on putting these together. So I think two things really, that there is a very scientific way of putting together guidelines, and it does take time and data and doing things properly, and we're starting to do that journey. And what will eventually happen with those, that the guidelines will be published after they've been worked on and put together, and that's certainly something we can put on the Brilliant Foundation website. And then the unique leaflet, I think again, that's once that's ready, hopefully that will be something. There's a leaflet I think I shared a long time ago on the Facebook groups, but this will be a much more comprehensive leaflet with a lot more information on it for families. So hopefully that will also answer lots of questions earlier on as well.
Any other questions from the group here? One thing I was going to say to kind of to build off of this is, as we are updating the website, one section that we've gotten a lot of feedback or a lot of requests around is this area that would be called Just Diagnosed, and help kind of guide people through that process to say, what were the things that we all wished we had at our disposal when we were just diagnosed, to help guide us through that process, answer some of those questions. And if you are so inclined and you would like to help us as we're thinking through this process, shoot me an email at thor, THOR, at wssfoundation.org. And we're going to be pulling together a proper committee, I suppose, of people to kind of guide and think about that from the parents' perspective, and then obviously incorporate some of these great resources that Dr. Jones and others have shared with us, and the Psych Lab has put together as part of that journey, to make sure that those are accessible and that we're linking to those experts and the great resources that do exist in our community so far. So once again,
brilliant.
Thor at wssfoundation.org.
That'd be great. And also, I think one of the problems with sorry, I see your hands up there, Nicola, with like academic work is that it's very difficult to digest if you haven't got that kind of background. So if it could be created in a way that's also accessible to people, communicated in sort of simple terms, that sort of thing, I think would be really great as well.
Yeah, I was just going to add, I just feel like, I know the sensory question I kind of rather brushed past, but I've been thinking about it. I don't have anything profound to say about it, other than to say, I do think, I mean, that is something that really is ripe for further research. But of the comments, so we haven't asked specifically in our interviews about sensory sensitivity, and the fact that so many people mentioned it spontaneously suggests that it's important. But what was particularly noticeable, I mean, we didn't have specific questions about it, so this is only a kind of a pilot, a kind of taster for what further research should do. But it was really clear that we weren't talking about all hyper or all hypo. There was a real mixture, and I know that the same can be true of other conditions like autism. And I am wondering, I'm going to invite Jane if she has anything to say about that, just because I know that she's looked at sensory sensitivities in other conditions, but you may or may not, Jane. I'm just leaving that open in case you can add anything.
Not directly in relation to pain. It's something that's come up in other groups in terms of whether there might be a relationship, and things it's been noted but not explored in a great detail. It is really interesting, I think, as you say, that it's come out spontaneously from those interviews and is so frequently noted. And there's quite a lot of research that's emerging that's linking sensory sensitivities and sensory differences to difficulties with anxiety, whether that's a direct link between sensory sensitivities and anxiety, or indirectly through kind of how that might interact with our ability to tolerate certainty, and how comfortable we are tolerating certainty in certain situations. And you see that sometimes linking with adherence to routines, wanting things to be a certain ways, not liking change. So I don't have a huge amount to add, I guess, specifically for this group yet, because I think there's so little that we've known, but we're right at the start of finding out some really interesting things. But I'm hoping that through we've got an upcoming survey that's going to include WSS, which is a survey that's looking at all different types of behaviour, including sensory sensitivity, looking at adherence to routine, anxiety, we might be able to start to look at whether some of those links are the same as we see in other groups, and that might give us some very interesting models to explore in terms of points for intervention or support for people with WSS.
Right, well, thank you. Oh, hang on, but one more question. Hang on, I'm trotting across the ballroom with my microphone.
I'm not sure if this is already discussed, but I was wondering, you were talking about resources or maybe decks or videos that would support schools with neurodiversity. And I was wondering if you already created like slides or materials around supporting educators or even district personnel around creating changes around being more inclusive, that is, and if we also have models of possibly schools or school districts that are very are moving ahead and are already creating models or pilots or programs where our students with neurodiversity feel really included and really supported by the community of neurotypical people.
Whilst everyone's gathering their thoughts, I haven't got a direct answer to this, I'm afraid, but there was just one thing that Wendy and I spoke about as the very first step. So again, for newly diagnosed parents, it's just a tiny thing, but it's one thing we'd quite like to work on together so that we get the phrasing right is to have a sort of template letter for clinicians to give to parents for them to pass on to their schools. So outlining the kind of things that teachers and schools should expect, or they might see, or the kind of issues or support structures that children might need, so that the parents have a concrete letter from a doctor telling the school what to expect. So even if there aren't official resources available, as you might get if you had some other kind of diagnosis, at least you've got some sort of statement about what to look for. And also in that letter, it could include links to information and resources such as your website or maybe our YouTube videos or something. So it's only a tiny thing. It hasn't answered your question, but that's something we're going to look at.
I'll just add to that, Camilla. It does make me realise, just talking about this now, that we are quite soon going to launch our video stories website, because almost all the people that we worked with who made the videos, a really wide range of people, in relation to autism specifically, all agreed to share their videos, which was wonderful because I think they were so proud of what they created, and they really felt that they showed the children in a really good light. We did have some young people making the videos themselves too, and so that site is going to go live. That project is literally just finishing, so that site will go up and we will put it on our ChatLab Twitter account, which is ChatLab UK. But it does make me realise that it might be possible, even to do on quite a small scale, to get, I am in touch with some parents of children with Wiedemann-Steiner syndrome, and if any of those were interested in making a story, we've got all sorts of tools that we've designed for our other population, and it might be possible to create one of these little 2-3 minute really positive stories, maybe more than one, because obviously each child's an individual. We're very aware of that. That's certainly something that's understood a lot in the world of autism. And I just wonder, it might be possible to create one of those and have it as another resource.
Nope. Oh, I am on now. We could include that on our newly revamped website as well. Thank you all so much for giving up your time. We're very conscious of the time difference and the fact it's a Saturday, and we really appreciate your contribution this afternoon. So thank you all very much.
Thank you so much as well for having us. I've really enjoyed it, and I hope that you've learned, found out some stuff. But if you've got any questions that you sort of couldn't think of today, but you want to ask us, please do reach out to us. The easiest way to get us is on Twitter, but otherwise, Annabelle or Thorm could share. They can certainly share out my academic email address if you want to use that as a starting point.
Thank you very much. We are going to break now for lunch. We resume our afternoon session at 1 o'clock promptly, please, because we've got Dr. Bjornsson presenting to us at 1. So have a good lunch, a good leg stretch, and see you all a little bit later.